Please provide a warm welcome to KrisAnne.
It's funny, one of the ladies at the table, when she was listening to the introductions on how I was a Russian linguist for the U.S. Army and my husband was a Russian instructor for the U.S. Navy, she said, "That's where you met him." I said, "Yeah, that's where I met him. He was my instructor." I am so happy to be here with you today. Again, this is how you find our information. If you are interested in our podcast, our radio show, and the things that we do, we are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, as long as they'll let us stay. iTunes, Google Music Play, SoundCloud, and Jesus Pod. We are on a number of different podcast formats. I don't even know what they are, because people actually just post us there, and we don't know, because we don't charge for our podcast, so we want people to share it wherever it goes. But Paul said, don't talk about the whole Russian thing, because, the collusion, but I just want to let everybody know, I'm not scared. I've been on the Southern Poverty Law Center's list of anti-government extremist hate groups for 5 years now. So their political bullying does not intimidate me, because I am grounded in the principles of liberty, and I am fluent in the history of our Constitution. And those are the kind of things that we need in America today, to infuse Americans with the courage to do what they need to do to take America back to its constitutional republic. How many of you think the federal government operates out of control? Just a little bit? A lot. Do you know, everywhere I go, even when I speak to progressive and more liberal-leaning groups, because I teach the Constitution, I don't teach politics. And the Constitution is a nonpartisan thing. So I actually get invitations to speak to groups who are of alternative political persuasions, because they're interested in knowing the truth about the Constitution. And when I teach them, they have the same answer. They believe the federal government is out of control. What's interesting to me is Thomas Paine said, "It's not in numbers that we gather our strength, but in unity." Wouldn't it be amazing if America could unite together under the banner of liberty to get our federal government back under control? The most asked question I get, no matter where I go, is how do we fix it? How many of you would like to know the answer to that question? Well, good news. That's what I'm going to show you tonight. Or this afternoon. I have no idea what time of day it is. This is actually my 8th class in 2 days. So you'll have to forgive me a little bit. You see, the interesting thing is, if we've been teaching the Constitution properly for the last 176 years, because that's where we jumped the rail, 176 years ago. If we actually taught the Constitution the way it's supposed to be taught, number one, we wouldn't be in the circumstances that we're in. And number two, if we had moved into these directions, we'd already know exactly what to do. It is the ignorance of the American people that keeps us discouraged and distracted and feeling already defeated before we even start. So what I'm going to show you today is how do we restore the constitutional republic? I mean, would you agree that we don't operate like a constitutional republic anymore? Some would probably say we are gravitating towards democracy, but I will tell you that we are more oligarchy than we will ever be democracy. I don't believe that America will ever become a democracy because we are already operating as an oligarchy. I mean, just think about it. The majority of Americans, including professors and politicians and judges and pundits, all believe that the Supreme Court are the supreme rulers of the universe. That they are only to be challenged and questioned by themselves, and that we are to submit slavishly to every of their whimsish, wildest opinions. Even though that our founders were very, very firm on the fact that the federal judiciary was the weakest branch of government, which had no power over purse or sword, no coercion whatsoever, and that their opinions, if not tethered to the Constitution and the original intent of those who wrote it, would be null and void. Now, these were certainties for the people who ratified the Constitution. And yet we put big fat question marks behind them. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to walk you through some truths. KrisAnne Hall does not teach KrisAnne Hall opinions. I don't believe in constitutional interpretations. The Constitution does not need to be interpreted. It is not written in Chinese. The Constitution needs to be applied. As it is a contract, it must be applied using the mechanisms of contract law, which absolutely and conclusively dictate that those who wrote and ratified the contracts are the authors and the authority on the meaning of the contract. The irony is, the Constitution is the only contract in the United States where judges and lawyers refuse to apply contract law. I suppose if you have a judge friend or a lawyer friend or a law professor friend or any kind of professor friend, and you went to them and said, okay, what we're going to do from this day forward, we're going to sit down with you, with the dean of your school, we're going to sit down with you and your boss, and we're going to look over your employment contract. But we need to be aware, we need to be sure that we understand that your employment contract is a living, breathing document, so it doesn't really mean what you wanted it to mean when you wrote it and you signed it. It means whatever we think it ought to mean today. How many of you think they're going to go on, happily on board with that? But they want us to believe that that is how the supreme law of the land, the supreme contract among the states, is supposed to be interpreted. The Constitution is not a living, breathing document. It is a hard and stand-fast standard for the operation of government, not subject to their interpretation and not subject to their desires, greed, avarice, whatever it is they have behind their heads. History is our greatest teacher, and it was the teacher of those who ratified the Constitution. I teach a history class. I taught it in Santa Fe the first morning that we were teaching in Santa Fe. It covers the 700 years that it actually took to write the Constitution. Our constitutional path began in the year 1041. And it was through this experience and the writing of the British Constitution, which consists of 5 charters, where our founders gained their experience. So when it came time to declare independence from Great Britain, to separate from their home kingdom, as Patrick Henry would say in his very famous speech, "Give me liberty or give me death," I have but one lamp by which my feet are guided, and that is the lamp of experience. I know no way to judge the future but by the past. We are sorely amiss today because our history is no longer taught. And when it is taught inaccurately. And because we don't understand how we got to where we are. We misinterpret, we misapply, and we miss completely the power we have and the solutions that have been put into our hands to keep our government limited and defined. Our Constitution was not written in a vacuum. And because we don't teach history, we don't really realize that, yes, those who separated from Great Britain, those who wrote our Constitution, suffered with taxation without representation, mandated purchases, denial of due process, with unlimited exercise of power by their government. There is absolutely nothing new, nothing novel, nothing invented in our Constitution and Bill of Rights. Everything inherited from history. Sometimes not just simply in principle, but verbatim itself. Our founders had the right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. They had a right to a trial by jury. They had a right to legislation through representation. They had a right to be free from excessive fines and cruel and unusual punishments. They had a right to be free from the quartering soldiers in their homes. And before we even know it, they had a right to freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of press, the right to peaceably assemble, and the right to petition the government for a redress of their grievances. These were not rights bestowed upon us by government. These are derivations of our natural rights, descending from God Himself by the nature of our creation. And the people who formed America knew this. They are natural rights. Samuel Adams said, among the natural rights of the colonists are these: first, life; second, in liberty; third, property, together with the right to protect and defend them in the best manner possible. He says, these are from the first law of nature, which is the duty of self-preservation. Our founders, to include Benjamin Franklin, that says, without freedom of thought, there can be no public liberty. And without freedom of speech, you have no property rights. And that's why Samuel Adams says all positive and civil laws should conform as far as possible to the law of natural reason and equity. That is what our Constitution is built upon, the principles of natural rights. That we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. So let me give you, we just came out of a holiday, right? I want to teach you a little bit about that holiday because it's relevant to our solutions available to us to keep control of the federal government. Our Independence Day is not July 4th, 1776. We celebrate that in error. Our Independence Day is actually July 2nd, 1776, when the Continental Congress, under the leadership of Richard Henry Lee, the author of the Lee Resolution, ratified the Lee Resolution, which is a 3-step process to declaring independence from Great Britain. What's interesting is the very first step of declaring independence from Great Britain was just simply, we're separate and independent. That's it. You see, because they knew that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. We were not given our rights by the King. So we don't have to ask His permission to be free. We are born free. It is contrary to natural law for any man to claim ownership over another man. We simply have to step up and declare it. So on July 2nd, the Continental Congress debated, voted, and ratified into law the Lee Resolution, making us no longer 13 colonies, but 13 independent sovereign states. It was on July 4th that we merely published and declared our independence. John Adams would write home to his wife Abigail on July 3rd and say, July 2nd will be an epic day where Americans will celebrate their independence forever. He said there'll be fireworks and pomp and circumstance and display of guns and feasts forevermore. And it wasn't until the late 1800s that we began celebrating our independence on July 4th. And now Americans run around Not calling it Independence Day, but calling it 4th of July, not knowing why we did what we did. Why did we declare our independence? What is the purpose and the role of the state? We know that the purpose and the role of the state has one purpose. It is declared in the Declaration of Independence. And that is to secure the rights of the people. To secure the rights of the people, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. That is the only reason the state of New Mexico exists. The state of New Mexico does not exist to hand out welfare. The state of New Mexico does not exist to regulate your business. The state of New Mexico does not exist to limit your access to property or to tell you where you have to send your children to school. The sole purpose of the existence of the state of New Mexico is to secure the rights of the people to make those choices on their own. And I should be getting an amen right there. Amen. Our state powers are to exist under the principles of natural law. Now, I don't know if you have a pocket constitution with you, but if you do, I want you to turn to the last paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, because we are going to learn this afternoon what it actually means to be a state. And we are not going to learn from KrisAnne Hall's opinion. We're going to learn from those who actually created our states. And the last paragraph of the Declaration of Independence says, "We therefore, the representatives of the United States, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies." Whose authority are we operating on? The people. By the authority of the good people, not the king. Right? Because God created us, not the king. We declare our independence because we are created free. What are we publishing and declaring? See, we solemnly publish and declare what we had done 2 days prior. That these colonies are no longer colonies. That have right to be free and independent states. That's the primary purpose, not just simply, well, the secondary purpose, other than listing the grievances of the king so that the colonists complied with their British law. By British law, they had to issue a list of grievances to the king. They had to give him 40 days to redress those grievances. And beyond 40 days, if the king refused to redress those grievances, by British law, they had the right to assail the king to whatever condition and whatever means was possible until they are made whole. Our assail began as simply saying, we are no longer part of you. But what's the difference between a colony and a state? You see, because we're not colonies anymore. We are free and independent states. Now continue with your Declaration of Independence. It says that they, the free and independent states, are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown and all political connection between them and the what? State of what? State of Great Britain. You see, we are learning the definition of the state because we're going to discover the solutions that our founders put in our hands to be an ultimate check and balance, to be the control of the federal government. The most powerful control on earth, James Madison said. You see, that word state is not simply synonymous with New Hampshire, Rhode Island, or Virginia. That word state is synonymous with Great Britain, France, Germany, or Spain. We created not 13 subsets of a future republic. We created 13 independent, sovereign governments that carried the same governmental power as every other sovereign country in the world. And you don't have to think that's my opinion, because I'm about to show you the truth of that. They say, because we are now free and independent, as free and independent states, they have. Now this is July 4th, 1776. Is there a federal government? So the power that we're about to list here can only be possessed by whom? The states. full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other things that every other country in the world can do. Not shared together, but independently. And this is the power that New Mexico holds today. Because nothing has changed. Somebody will try to say to you, well, KrisAnne's not being totally truthful, you see, because the Declaration of Independence was about the first 13. And since New Mexico is not part of the first 13, this doesn't apply to you. Only that is legally, constitutionally, and politically incorrect. There is a doctrine in law through our Constitution called the Equal Footing Doctrine that says every state that enters the Union enters on equal footing with the first 13. So New Mexico, there's your footprint. Somebody might say, okay, well that may be who New Mexico was when you formed her as a state, but when you entered into the Union, you surrendered certain power. Not constitutionally correct, not historically correct, not politically correct. Completely and utterly false. Think about this. How many of you know of a sovereign government by the name of Germany? Some of you don't know Germany. Can we all agree we know Germany? Didn't Germany join the European Union? So let's all hold a town hall meeting. We'll all fly over to Germany and we'll explain to the German people and their chancellor that Germany is no longer a sovereign country because they joined the European Union. How do you think the German folks are going to take that little bit of news? So why do the people of New Mexico accept it? New Mexico joined the American Union. And you joined a union who believes in greater sovereignty than Germany ever believed. We believe that we are endowed by our Creator with certain rights. Germany believed that they are endowed by their king. New Mexico was created with greater sovereignty, and yet our people accept greater servitude. And I firmly believe that is because we have been taught the wrong things for a very long time. So we must understand that the states are sovereign and independent governments. Now, what kind of document is the Constitution? The Constitution, legally speaking, is a contract. It is a legally binding contract, but it's a special kind of contract. Generally speaking, a contract is an agreement between two sovereign people. Now, when I say that, I mean that in the legal aspect, as if you have achieved the age of legal consent. Can your 15-year-old make a legally binding contract? No, because they're not sovereign in the eyes of the law. Well, the Constitution is not an agreement between legally sovereign people. The Constitution is what we call a compact. It is an agreement between legally sovereign governments. Now, what are the only legally sovereign governments that existed prior to the ratification of our Constitution? The states, right? Does everybody agree? So our Constitution being a compact, which is defined as an agreement between legally sovereign governments, we must then know from a legal perspective that the states are the creators of the Constitution. They are the legal parties to the agreement. In knowing that that the Constitution is a compact between the states, we must then admit that the states are the parties to the compact from a legal basis, and that the central government is the product of the contract. When did the federal government exist? Not until the Constitution was ratified. You see, there's an error today in understanding what the Constitution is. People will say to you, well, KrisAnne's not telling you the truth. We all know, we've known for a long time that the Constitution is an agreement between the people and the federal government. You know the answer to that and why that is false. One simple question proves that. Was the Constitution ratified by popular vote of the people?
No.
No. How was it ratified? By the states. Since the people did not ratify the Constitution, they are not the parties
to the Constitution. The states are the parties to the Constitution. Somebody might try to say, well, what KrisAnne really means is that the Constitution is an agreement between the states and the federal government. That is a temporal impossibility. The federal government is the product of the compact. You cannot be a party to the contract if you are the product of the contract, because you cannot sign the document into legal being if you don't exist until it's already signed. So we have to know that the states are the creators of the Constitution, which makes them the creators of the federal government. The states created the Constitution created the federal government, therefore the states are the creators of the federal government. Now, when the states created the federal government, they created a limited and defined central government. And then they did the most important thing they could have ever done. They reserved all other power to themselves. So what power went where? Because this is the beginning of the key to controlling the federal government. Understanding there is a separation of power between the state and federal governments. James Madison, we call him the father of the Constitution, wrote a document we call Federalist 45, in which he was explaining to those who were about to ratify the Constitution the separation of powers between the state and federal government. Now I want us to pay very close attention to the grammar here. He says, the powers what? Delegate. Are the words delegate and surrender, are they synonymous? Are you sure? It's okay to be sure. If you are sure, give yourself a hand. You now know more than the Supreme Court of the United States. I have seen the pinnacle of conservative justices say things like states surrendered power. That is absolutely not true. The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those that remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. And then he tells us specifically the kind of power the federal government will have. The power of the federal government will be exercised principally on external objects: war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce. Federal power was designed to not only be limited, but to be primarily external. Now let me ask you a question here, because you've seen this list of power in a greater sense in another place just a minute ago. War, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce. Do you remember where we just saw that? Right, the state powers through the Declaration of Independence. Let's look at this. Full power, levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do other acts and things, right? Well, Madison is telling us the powers delegated to the federal government are these powers, right? And they existed first in the states. So who delegated power to the federal government? The states. This is such a powerful fact. All you need is a dictionary. Because the definition of that word delegate is a temporary trust of responsibility of authority by a higher power to a lower power. We have just all admitted that the states are the delegators of power to the federal government. Then we must also admit that the states are the higher power and the federal government is the lower power. Not only that, our delegation of power to the federal government is a temporary trust. So when the federal government fails that trust, they exercise power they've not been delegated, exercise power they've been delegated, but they exercise it wrong. We retain the authority to take it back. It's like an employer-employee relationship. If I have a business and I make hamburgers, fries, and milkshakes, if I'm Superwoman, I can do all that by myself. But since I'm not, I have to hire people, right? A burger guy, a fry guy, and a shake guy. What if the burger guy comes in one day and says, I don't feel like making burgers today? Do I have to hang a sign on the door telling my customer there'll be no burgers today? No, what do? I fire him. So now I fire him, he walks out the door. When he walks out the door, do I hang up a sign that says, I'm sorry, my burger guy quit today, and when he left, he took the burger power with him? That's not how that works. Why? Because I didn't surrender my power to him. I delegated it, which is a temporary trust, and that's the exact same relationship that exists between the states and the federal government, as the states are the creators and the delegators, and the federal government hold that trust as a product of the states. Madison goes on to tell us about this separation of powers, specifically the powers that are reserved to the states. This is so very important. The powers reserved to the several states will extend to, what is that word there? All. Do we know what all means? Because I know we got people in DC who want to equivocate on the meaning of is. So we can get all, right? All the objects which in the, what? Ordinary course of affairs concerns the lives, the liberties, and the properties of the people, the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state. State power is not only internal, it is numerous, and it is reserved. Where does that leave us with the federal EPA, FDA, and the Bureau of Land Management? Don't those involve the properties of the people? Those would be powers reserved to the states, not delegated. What about the Department of Education, Health and Human Services, USDA, and the ATF? Would that not be the lives of the people and the properties of the people? All reserved to the state. What about the FBI, the DHS, the DOI, the Department of Ag, the FAA, the FCC, and any other three letters you can string together? All of these executive agencies describe power that is reserved to the states, which means the federal government does not have the authority to exercise this power. Where did we go wrong? I think it's simply a lack of understanding of simple definitions. That word reserved means to exercise dominion over a thing to the exclusion of all others. If there's a chair up here and it says a sign on it that says reserved to KrisAnne Hall, what do I have the power to do if somebody else sits in it? Kick them out, right? If the sign says reserved and I don't have the power to kick them out, is the chair really reserved? You see, the power being reserved to the states gives them ownership, property rights over that power, which means they have the right to say no to anyone exercising that power that exists outside the state. Can France come tell New Mexico how to run their business? No, because that's your power. Can Texas tell New Mexico how to run their business? No. Our creators of the Constitution and the federal government want us to know that the federal government is just as much of a foreign power as France or Texas when it comes to the power that is reserved to the states. Now, if we decline this understanding, then there are certain consequences that we must accept. If somebody says, no, that's not right, the federal government has the authority to exercise power within the state of New Mexico, and the state of New Mexico cannot say no, then you must accept the following consequences. Number one, the power is not reserved to the states, which means it's open to anyone. France can come tell you what to do, and so can Texas. Number two, if it's not reserved, then there is no limit to federal authority. If you must simply submit to every demand of power by the federal government, then you must admit that the federal government is not limited and defined, and its only limits are those it establishes for itself. And finally, if the state of New Mexico or any other state in the Union must simply slavishly submit to every demand of the federal government, you must admit that New Mexico is not sovereign. And if New Mexico is not sovereign, if our states are not sovereign, then guess what? The Constitution itself is null and void because you must be a sovereign government to create a compact. And if the Constitution itself is null and void, then you do not live in a constitutional republic, you legally live in an oligarchy. But here's the good news. New Mexico is sovereign. The Constitution is a legally binding document. The federal government is limited and defined, the power is reserved, and the only thing that has to change is this. That's it. Because the only change that has happened is the deception that has happened in the American mind to believe that the federal government is the supreme power over all. I want you to see what our founders are saying. James Madison says to us, in two places, Federalist 51 and Federalist 39, we have a separation of powers between the state and the federal government. They do not overlap. Look what he says. A double security arises to the rights of the people. What is the purpose of the federal government, of any government? To secure the rights of the people, right? The different government will control each other at the same time that each will be controlled by itself. Local or municipal authorities form distinct and independent portions of supremacy, no more subject within their respective authorities than the general authority is subject to them. Your federal government has no authority in your state without your state's opinion on, without your state's permission on matters that are not delegated by the Constitution. And that's what the 10th Amendment says. Let me move through this really quickly, because these are some very, very important points. I'm showing you the solutions here. Thomas Jefferson says, whenever the general government assumes undelegated authorities, its acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force. If I stole his car, would I have the authority to drive it? Would I have the authority to sell it? No, because my power over that car was never properly legally delegated, which makes every act I commit over it void and of no force. If I sell the car, is it a legally binding sale? No, it's not. If I sell his car, it is a criminal act, right? Well, that's what Jefferson is trying to explain to us. When the federal government exercises power outside the Constitution's delegation, it is stealing that power from the state. It is not only unconstitutional, it is criminal. Now let me ask you a very simple solution-oriented question. Does he have to sue me to get his car back? No, he simply provides the title deed to the vehicle, and the officials have to return it to him. Do the states have to sue the federal government to get their power back? No. They simply have to show the title deed to their power and claim it. For the states to sue the federal government to get their power back, two things must be admitted. It would be like, tell me your name again. Pat. It would be like Pat suing me to get his car back, showing up in court and finding out that the judge and the jury are all my family members. Right? Because the states would be suing the federal government where? In federal court, with federal judges that are appointed by the federal government. And to admit, to sue the federal government to get their power back, every state must admit, finally, that the federal government is the sole authority for the limit of its own power, and that the states must simply slavishly submit to whatever its decision may be. We must interpose. That's what Madison says, you must interpose. That word interposition means eclipse. You are duty bound to do that because you are protecting the rights of the people. How does interposition work? Thomas Jefferson says we do that through nullification. Nullification is simply enforcing the Constitution by saying you cannot exercise that power here. Hamilton tells us anything contrary to the Constitution is void. And that's exactly what the Supremacy Clause, Article 6, Clause 2 of the Constitution says, that if an act made by Congress is not in pursuance to the Constitution, then the judges of every state are not bound by it. Every act by Congress must be made in pursuance to the Constitution, or it is null and void. And so does the Supreme Court agree. This is from NFIB Sibelius. This is Roberts. Look at what he says. In the typical case, Madison said, in the ordinary course of affairs, right? In the typical case, we look to the states to defend their prerogatives by adopting the simple expedient of not yielding. He is telling you, you don't have to have federal health care. You don't have to pay fines for not having it. You have a duty, if you don't want it, to say no, and the federal government cannot come after you with it. Why? Because you are separate and independent sovereigns, and you have to act like it. James Madison calls your state legislators the greatest opponents to the federal government, the most powerful thing on earth, to be the sure guardians of the people's liberty. You are supreme in your jurisdiction, and the federal government has no power over you unless you submit here. One last person here I want you to see. James Wilson. The power of the Constitution predominates, and anything therefore that shall be enacted by Congress contrary thereto will not have the force of law. Our states need to remember and to relearn the power of simply saying, no, we will not comply. That is the most powerful check and balance. That is not an invention. That is not a theory. That is a principle and a check and balance that was put in place by those who wrote and ratified the Constitution. It was expected that the states would come on board when the federal government escaped its boundaries and say, we created you, we trusted you, you violated that trust, and you have no more power over us in this matter. Any matter that is properly delegated, we have an obligation by contract to submit to. But if the power is not delegated, it is reserved to us, and it is null and void by the federal government. And you can start doing this tomorrow. You can. Let me show you really quick. We have sheriffs that are nullifying federal agencies as a whole, kicking the USDA and the FDA out of Elkhart, Indiana, and they're still gone. He was heralded as a hero by his people. We have this sheriff kicking out the Federal Forestry Service so that his people can have livelihood and prosper. But we need to remember that our laws are built on liberty, which is freedom plus morality. And it is immoral to enforce and submit to an unconstitutionally exercised law. It is contrary to natural law, it is contrary to Constitution, and it is contrary to the rights of the people, which makes it triply wrong. Thank you so much for having me today. Now, I'm not sure how long that took me, but it took me an extra 5 minutes, sorry. I blew through a 90-minute course for you in 40 minutes. Back on the table where my son Colton is, I have the book Sovereign Duty, which teaches you completely this issue, not only from state but from local to county level, on what our founders intended us to do to fix this. We have DVDs on the back table that will teach you other aspects of the Constitution and the power of the people to enforce the Constitution. We have an online training program called Liberty First University. We don't offer degrees. We do something that colleges don't do. We offer education. So I think you wanted me to take some questions?
Yeah, we have time for a few questions.
I have rules for questions, just so you know. Since we only have a few minutes, we have 2 rules. Rule number 1, you have to get to your question quickly. quickly so we can get to lots of questions. And number 2, you have to allow me the liberty to not know everything about everything. Okay? Good news is I'm not running for office, so I'm not going to try to convince you that I know everything about everything. And if there's something that I can't answer for you, I will work together with you to help you. How many of you enjoyed this afternoon's class? How many of you can think of at least 3 people who should have been here with you today? All right, so I'm going to be teaching about the 4th Amendment and property rights in Santa Fe tonight at 7 p.m. And then after me, my husband's going to be teaching a powerful, life-changing class called More Than Victims, America's Hidden Black History. Black men and women that created America as free black men and women before the Emancipation Proclamation. He has taught this to groups of black men and women and young people of 2,000 and more, and they rushed out, life changed, to get the DVD so they could share it with others. You don't want to miss this class. Then tomorrow here in Albuquerque at 9 a.m. I will be teaching on the oath of office, and that at 6 p.m. I'm going to be teaching a great class called The Forgotten Founders. You can find all of this at KrisAnneHall.com, which is not up there, but should be. KrisAnneHall.com, you can find all that. So first question. Yes, sir.
Under the New Mexico State Constitution, Article 22, Section 19, any officer except legislator has to post a surety bond where that office is void.
Mm-hmm.
That is not being enforced in the state. There's no precedent law or significance on it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we should exercise.
So what's your question?
The question is, how do we go to federal court to enforce that? Because it's not, I don't think it's in the federal constitution.
Okay, so you're right. This is entirely a state issue. This is not a federal issue. You do not want to evoke federal authority where it does not exist. As a matter of fact, I have a DVD back there on the federal judiciary as it was created and it is intended. And you will learn that our founders specifically and intentionally excluded federal courts from internal state matters. So what you have to do is enforce it within your state. And if the officials in your state will not enforce it, then you, as the people, must come together in a unity and change your government and make it happen. And listen to me, how many of you can sort of glean from the fact that I speak rather boldly, and I don't mince words? So please accept this next statement with the greatest of love and compassion in my heart. If you can't get control of your state and local governments, then you've got no business being in federal government business. My dad used to always say, if you can't keep your backyard in order, then stay out of your neighbors. If you can't control your city council and your county commission, you've got no business trying to control the U.S. Congress. If you can't control your sheriff or your state legislators, you've got no business trying to control the president or the attorney general. If you can't control your governor and your state courts, then don't even complain about the Supreme Court, because the ultimate majority of the power was left here in the state, because that's where you have the control. And if we don't even know how to control our states, we are clueless on how to control the federal government. Yes, sir. Go ahead and stand up so it's easier for me to hear you.
Sure. This idea, the premise of telling the federal government is great. Mexico is a state that gets $2 back for every dollar that we send to the federal government in taxes. Our educational programs require grants and funds that we get from the feds. How do we say no when we really do, and maybe your last statement is the answer, but how do we replace the federal money that comes here if we keep telling them no and they cut it off?
The lure of federal money is a wicked illusion. It costs you more to take that money than to turn it down. And this is a proven fact. If you don't send them $1 for your $2 that you return, you will save $5, $10, $20, $200 because it costs you 100 times that $2 to comply with all the regulations and all the red tape and all of the requirements that follows along with that $2. And that is a proven fact. I can give it to you from a small municipal level. In Texas, the school districts when Obama was president, the Texas school districts did not want the mandated menu. And when they refused the federal lunch menu, they lost federal lunch money. Now, school districts that accept federal lunch money, and these in Texas showed us this by their line-by-line itemization, they actually were sometimes $30,000 to $80,000 a year in the hole trying to comply with all the regulations and the extra people that they had to have for the paperwork and the applications and the regulations imposed on the buildings and the teachers and all of that by just simply taking that federal lunch money. When they refused the federal lunch money, they found themselves to be $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 ahead. And then the school districts discovered the kids actually liked the nutritional lunches that the schools created. They bought more lunches. They made money by selling the lunches, and they made enough money by selling the lunches to create a local program for people who cannot afford their school lunches. That is the level of government where charity is. If charity exists in government, and I don't believe it should exist in government, but if charity exists in government, it must exist at the local level only. So I challenge you. I challenge you to challenge a friendly, like-minded representative to do the math. And they will find, because I'm telling you, this solution, New Mexico will have a prosperity you cannot even fathom if you just tell them no. Yes, sir.
Last question. So I have a very simple question. I'll start with my question.
Good, I like those.
The
Stand up so I can hear you better, please.
Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, the list of powers granted to Congress, part of your compact, gives the federal government the right to do some things on immigration.
Mm-hmm.
We have established some immigration laws.
Mm-hmm.
We have state governments, local governments, which are basically arms of the states,
Mm-hmm.
declaring sanctuary cities and are being declaring themselves unwilling to
Mm-hmm.
cooperate.
Mm-hmm.
In your vision of this relationship and the delegation of the powers by the states, do these states have the right to do that?
I am so glad you said that. I'm so glad you answered that question, because here's the thing. Some people will say to you, KrisAnne is advocating for lawlessness. The states can just simply do whatever they want. No. You see, nullification is not the states disobeying the law. Nullification is the states enforcing the Constitution when the federal government violates the law. The federal government was delegated the authority to make uniform rules of naturalization. We are members of that contract. When we become members of that contract, we agree to the terms of that contract. The term of that contract is the federal government will make the uniform rules of naturalization, not the states. There's actually a history of why it has to be that way. So New Mexico, as a member of the Union, in compliance with their contractual agreement, must follow the uniform rule of naturalization. New Mexico, or any state in the Union, that gives benefits of citizenship to non-citizens is violating their contractual agreement and their fiduciary agreement with every other state in the Union. If your state is giving tax dollars, in California, sometimes aliens are running for office and holding office. If your state is allowing aliens to vote, giving money, giving health care, giving schooling, all of these are benefits of citizenship and need to be reserved to people who have legally gone through the uniform rule of naturalization. And any state that is operating contrary to that is violating the terms of the contract, and every other state in the Union ought to react with notifying the state, hey, you're beyond our contract here. You're breaking the rules of our contract, the terms of our contract. Get in order, or we're going to expel you from the agreement. If you have business partners that have a contractual agreement and one business partner goes totally off the rails and starts embezzling money and starts violating the company's policies, you don't have to simply keep them in the business contract. They removed themselves by their actions. And that's what we need to do. We need to realize that we are in a contractual agreement with each other, and states that violate that agreement are violating their trust with us and other states. And simply, we have to bring sanctions against them. Thank you. God bless you all.
Thank you all. I know she could be here all afternoon answering questions and engaging with you folks. I would just encourage you to come to the other events that she's got here in New Mexico. We're so pleased to have her. Thank you, KrisAnne, for coming and speaking here at the Rio Grande Foundation event. Thank you for coming out. We're active, engaged. We're working to do exactly what KrisAnne said, which is to get our own houses in order. County, city, school board, legislature, governor, those are the things that we need to do before New Mexico gets expelled from the union. Because if I was, let's put it that way, I mean, New Mexico is in many ways not worthy of the Constitution, the way we've conducted ourselves. We need to get our house in order here, and that's what the Rio Grande Foundation is all about. So go buy a book, find out more about what KrisAnne is doing. Thank you all for your time and attention, and we appreciate you coming. Thanks.